Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Jnana-timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurum Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Uta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamsta Shri Rupam Sagajatam Sagana Raghunatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sarvaitam Savadutam Paritana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sagana Lalita Shri Vishaka Vitamsta Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagapate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shrunivari Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadara Shri Vasari Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So, welcome to our study of this Bhagavad Gita. So today we'll begin discussing this most wonderful chapter 15. So in chapter 14, Krishna has spoke about how the jiva is trapped within the body due to conditioning by the three modes. We talked about the Kshetra and the Kshetra Gyan in chapter 13. And in the last chapter, Krishna spoke about how the modes of material nature bind the living entity to this material world to do various types of conditioning. And at the end of the 14th chapter, in response to Arjuna's questions, hold on one second. In response to Arjuna's questions, Krishna spoke about how to transcend the modes and how to become free from the modes. And he said, Mam chayo vipacharena bhakti yogena sevata sagunan samititena brahma bhuya kalpate. That by doing unfailing devotional service, one can get beyond the modes of material nature. Right? So, the process to get beyond these modes, to get beyond the conditioning, because we know each mode has a particular way in which it conditions us, and by knowing that and seeing that Krishna is beyond the modes, one can ultimately surrender to Krishna. So it brings us to the point of devotional service. So chapter 15, now Krishna is going to speak about this linking process with the Supreme. We see this title of the chapter is Yoga of the Supreme Person, Purushottama Yoga. And we know yoga from all the way back from chapter 3 means the process by which we link to the Supreme. So here we're going to get information about Bhakti Yoga, devotional service. And so the main analogy that we're going to understand in the beginning of this chapter that Krishna will put forth, or a metaphor from technical terms, is the metaphor of this banyan tree, and how the banyan tree as representative of the material world and the living entity is moving from branch to branch, entangled in it. And we remember back all the way to the beginning of Bhagavad Gita where two birds sitting in a tree, and one is observing the other enjoy the fruits. That observing bird is the spirit soul, the super soul Paramatma, and the living entity is within the heart as well, trying to enjoy all the fruits of the material world. So in this chapter, there'll be three main questions answered. The first is how to begin devotional service. The second is what is Brahman? And finally, what do the Vedas relate to? What is the understanding of the Vedas? So we'll see that in this chapter. And the first 6 verses, Krishna is going to discuss how to detach from the material world and how this is very important. Then he's going to discuss in the next 5 verses the transmigration of the spirit soul and how it moves from body to body. And then he'll discuss conclusively how Krishna is our maintainer, and that would lead us to surrender to him. And that is, and we'll see how every aspect of our life is dependent on the Supreme Lord, and that will conclude one to surrender. And finally, in the last 4 verses, we'll get 3 verses that are another set of what we call 3 shloki verses, which give a summary of the Vedanta Sutra and ultimately the conclusion of this chapter. So this is the summary of this chapter and how it flows in these 20 verses. Very, very beautiful chapter. So today we'll discuss the first 10 verses, and we'll begin by discussing this metaphor of the banyan tree. So in verse 1, Krishna says, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, it is said that there is an imperishable banyan tree that has its roots upwards and its branches down, and whose leaves are Vedic hymns. One who knows this tree is the knower of the Vedas. So lots of information here to unpack. So the main metaphor, the banyan tree, Krishna is using to explain detachment from the material world. So this whole example Krishna is giving is really going to get us centered around how to extricate ourselves from the material world. And the big major point and theme here is detachment. Detachment from material entanglements is critical, and thus this metaphor is being used. Krishna has spoken already about devotional service, and he has spoken about how that is the means to get beyond the modes, as he said at the end of the 14th chapter. And now we're going to see that detachment from material activities is the basic principle of devotional service. So this detachment from material activity, it is the principle of devotional service. Actually, one's progress in devotional service is measured by the extent of one's material detachment. So we'll talk a little bit about that further in a few minutes. So this basic principle of the process of detaching from the material world is what Krishna will explain by using this banyan tree. Right? And so let's understand now, Krishna has said that the banyan tree has its roots upwards and its branch down. What is the meaning of that specifically? This banyan tree of the material world is understood that the material world is a reflection of the spiritual world. And when we see a reflection, it is completely the opposite of whatever object is being reflected. Right? So this material world, everything that we see here, it is a reflection of the spiritual world. But it is a perverted reflection. It is not a pure reflection. And so whatever that we are trying to enjoy in this material world, we should understand that that activity exists in its pure form in the spiritual world. Because whatever is in the reflection must be present in the real object, otherwise how it can be reflected, right? So everything in this material world is but a perverted reflection in the spiritual world. So in the spiritual world, there is great variety. There's great different activities. There was individual living entities enjoying with Krishna. So all the things that we try to see here in the material world, again, exist in their pure form in the spiritual world. And that is very, very important because it leads one to understand that actually, let us try to enjoy the reality, not the reflection. Just like if you were going to go see, the great Taj Mahal, and there are great ponds of water in front, you're not going to observe the Taj Mahal by simply looking in the water to see the reflection. You want to observe the real thing. So similarly, trying to enjoy in the material world is just like trying to observe the Taj Mahal through those reflective ponds. It is not, as pure of an experience as seeing the real thing. So this material world is but a reflection. And thus Krishna is saying the roots are going up and the branches downward, to help us very clearly understand that. And we see this phenomenon of a tree such way on a pond. a pond in which is reflecting a tree. When you look at a tree in the pond, you'll see the branches down and the roots upward, right? And it is reflecting a tree that may be at the edge of this pond. So we do see this in the material world, and so that reflection in that pond also is very indicative that there's a bank along that pond, the edge of the pond. That is the point at which we move from reality to inflection. Above the bank, we see the real tree. Below the bank, we see the reflection into the water. Right? So that bank is the demarcation point where we break from reality to reflection. And that edge is representative of our desires. As soon as we obtain individual desires separate from Krishna, we move from the reality of the spiritual world into the reflective material world. That is the fact. So the edge of that pool of water is designated as our desires. So that as soon as these individual desires manifest to be separate from Krishna, we come to the material world. And the final point about the banyan tree and its metaphor is the complexity of the webs and the branch structure of a banyan tree. Banyan tree is so complicated in its branches and structures. You cannot really trace out the beginning or the end. Similarly, in the material world, it is a very complex web in which one can bounce branch to branch, and we'll talk a little bit about that, trying to enjoy unlimited desires. In a banyan tree, there are an unlimited number of fruits to enjoy. Similarly, in the material world, there are unlimited fruits to try to enjoy, and it is based on our unlimited desires. So we cannot see, again, the beginning or the end. So this banyan tree now, one must understand how to get out of it. One who wants to get out must first understand the nature of this tree in detail, or again, metaphorically, representing the material world. So Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur speaks about and gives some comment about this word ashvata, which means will not exist tomorrow, that which will not exist tomorrow. And this material realm, it is eternal and temporary. For the devotees, the material world will not exist tomorrow because they will become liberated and go back to the spiritual world, to the reality of life. And for the non-devotees, it won't exist tomorrow in the sense that everything that one is trying to enjoy, the fruits, are very temporary. They will cease to exist. So they are very temporary. But there's a permanence of the material world in the sense that the material nature is permanent. It is going through the cycle of creation, maintenance, and destruction, back to creation, maintenance, and destruction. And for the materialist, their presence within the material world is eternal. So yes, the fruits are temporary. The actual manifestation is temporary because it's going through these cycles. But the presence of the overall material creation is eternal. And so thus we see this material world being both eternal and temporary. Now, the trees we see whose leaves are the Vedic hymns. So the leaves of any tree are what are attractive. When we go and observe a great tree, the leaves become very attractive, right? In certain parts of the world, I know in where we live, people go for fall color watching to see the changing of the colors of the leaves. So these leaves are the attractive part of the tree. It's what do we first see from a great distance away from that tree. And so these leaves represent the Vedic hymns, which are the karma kanda processes by which one can obtain great fruits of the material world. Still very temporary and limited in their enjoyment, but relative to other fruits, they are more enjoyable. So the leaves of this tree represent the Vedic hymns. And ultimately, the four fruits of this tree are the Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. This sense enjoyment, the liberation, the material pleasures and things like that. So that's the the fruits that one is ultimately trying to enjoy in this material world. Right? So finally, in this verse, Krishna makes a very important point. One who knows this tree is the knower of the Vedas. Now that's a very wonderful statement, because the Vedas are so vast, and how one can know the vast Vedas? Well, we're going to see in this chapter that the ultimate purpose of the Vedas is to know Krishna. And Krishna is going to say that very clearly in the 15th verse of this chapter. So Prabhupada makes the point in the purport that one who is in devotional service, serving Krishna, by definition, then already knows the Vedas. Sometimes we read Bhagavad Gita, we read Srimad Bhagavatam, we wonder, well, what about the Vedas? Well, when you know Krishna, your object of your activities is to link with Krishna, Purushottam Yoga, then you are become already the knower of the Vedas, because that is the purpose of the Vedas. And so Prabhupada writes in the purport, I just wanted to read the last part of his purport. He says, the material reflection of the real tree has to be cut off. When it is said that a person knows the Vedas, it is assumed that he knows how to cut off attachment to this material world. If one knows that process, he actually knows the Vedas. One who is attracted to the ritualistic formulas of the Vedas is attracted by the beautiful green leaves of a tree. He does not exactly know the purpose of the Vedas. The purpose of the Vedas, as disclosed by the personality of Godhead himself, is to cut down this reflected tree and attain the real tree of the spiritual world. So Prabhupada makes it very clear that knower of the Vedas is not one who can recite the Vedic hymns that give one, material fruits in the material world. He or she is not the knower of the Vedas. One who knows how to cut themselves free from this reflective tree of the material world is actually the knower of the Vedas. One who knows Krishna. So this is very clearly established by Krishna in this first verse of this purport. And so, if we ever encounter, we understand we are the knower of the Vedas as soon as one comes to the process of devotional service. Okay? So with that introduction, now we'll move on to more description of the tree. In the second verse, Krishna says, the branches of this tree extend downward and upward, nourished by the three modes of material nature. The twigs are the objects of the senses. This tree also has roots going down, and these are bound to the fruitive actions of human society. So these twigs, these are the green buds at the end of a branch. They represent our bondage to fruitive activities. And fruitive action kicks off a cycle that becomes very difficult for us. Because when we do fruitive activities, we acquire some fruits. Right? And that increases then our desire for more. There becomes a greed for those fruits. And the tree gives more sense objects. And then more desires manifest. And then one continues to endeavor very intensely to try to satisfy those never-ending desires. And thus, the fruits, desires, and work, this cycle continues over and over and over again. And it becomes very, very difficult to then break free. Right? So these twigs, the Prabhupada explains in the purport, they are the sense objects, the sound, the touch, the form, the smell. Right? So this cycle leads us to an existence of working harder and harder, trying to satisfy these ever-increasing unlimited desires. And how many desires? Just as there are unlimited roots and branches in a giant banyan tree. So many options and varieties to try to enjoy in this material world. But the result of all of it is one: difficulty and suffering. So depending on which branch we are on, we'll have a certain type of body and senses. And we'll see this more clearly as we talk about the transmigration of the soul. But based on if we're on the higher branches or the lower branches, we'll be attracted to certain types of sense objects, these twigs. Just as we see, a pig is enjoying eating stool, yet a human may enjoy eating gulab jamuns. Now, the satisfaction of that eating is the same, but the object that is satisfying is very different based on the type of body one has. So, based on where one is in this tree, one finds different, enjoyment. So the higher branches are considered the higher planets, the middle are the middle planets, the lower are the lower planets. And many different varieties of life forms exist. 8.4 million species, as we know, trying to enjoy. And so the living entity is moving around from branch to branch in different bodies, sometimes going up, sometimes going down, based on our desires and the laws of karma, trying to satisfy these unlimited desires. And so this giant banyan tree is indicative of the breadth of this material universe, the complexity of all the different types of fruits enjoyment one can try to pursue, and moving from the higher planets down to the lower planets. And the root of this tree is Brahmaloka. That is the highest material planet where Lord Brahma resides. That is like the foundation of this tree. Okay? And so just to, again, summarize, the leaves, again, were the Vedic hymns. The twigs were the sense objects. The tips of the branches, those were the senses. And the fruits are this, dharma, artha, kama, moksha. This different pleasures, working, liberation, and whatnot. So the tree has unlimited fruits and unlimited desires based on our unlimited desires, and there's no end to one's pursuit of them. So now in verse 3 and 4, Krishna begins to speak about how to become ultimately free. The real form of this tree cannot be perceived in this world. No one can understand where it ends, where it begins, or where its foundation is. But with determination, one must cut down this strongly rooted tree with the weapon of detachment. Thereafter, one must seek that place from which, having gone, one never returns, and there surrender to that Supreme Personality of Godhead, from whom everything began and from whom everything is extended since time immemorial. So 2 verses are presented here together. And we see that the real form of this tree cannot be found in the material world. It exists in the spiritual world. So everything that we see here, everything that we're experiencing, is just a perverted reflection of reality that is present only in the spiritual world. So again, whatever it is we're trying to enjoy, we should rest assured we can enjoy in its purest form in the spiritual world. We will leave nothing behind. Just as whatever you are observing in the reflection, rest assured you will observe it in its pure form in the real object, because nothing in the reflection can be present that is not present in the real object. Okay? So very, very important point. And so once entangled, it's difficult. Krishna says it's impossible to find where it begins, where it ends. Right? It's such a complex web of branches and roots that, one cannot cut it down. To think to cut down such a tree, you cannot really break that tree. It's very, very difficult. Right? So then what to do? How to get out of this entanglement? Right? That is the key that Krishna is trying to explain to us. And he says that one must cut down this strongly rooted tree with the weapon of detachment. It means one must extricate themselves by detaching from the material world. So detachment is the weapon that is needed to cut oneself free. Need to understand how the entangling illusory energy and the illusory nature of this material world, and see how it is binding us. And when we do, we'll be able to cut it out, seeing the very horrible nature of this material world, being very full of suffering and difficulty. Right? So the key is to understand with knowledge and discrimination what is good and what is bad. So what is the actual meaning of detachment? It means not to identify with the body, with the material world. Understanding again from the very beginning of 2nd chapter, I am spirit soul. This is the point of a detachment. Understanding that this material energy around me, yes, it is there. I am present within it, but I shall use it in the service of Krishna. Understanding, trying to enjoy the fruits of this body is a fruitless attempt at finding happiness. So one who is detached from the material world still may be within it, living in it, but detached from the understanding that I am this body. One is fully understanding that I am spirit soul and working in devotional service. So that is the meaning of detachment. And then what keeps this weapon of detachment strong, sharp, right? To cut some object, you need a sharp knife, a sharp axe. You know, this detachment is considered like an axe, where you can cut the branches to free oneself. But what keeps that weapon sharp, that axe sharp, it is the discrimination, the knowledge, right, of what to do and what not to do. One must be disciplined to avoid the sense objects. You know, there is such a strong pull to the sense objects. And so one must be very intelligent. One has to have great knowledge, discrimination, to be able to resist that urge, because one has been trying to enjoy the fruits for millions of lifetimes. So that strong urge is there. So one should use discrimination to keep the weapon of detachment very strong. Because the bond, the attachment to sense objects is strong, thus the weapon itself must also be strong. So that's how we keep this, this weapon of detachment very strong, is by good knowledge and discrimination. And that is what Krishna is giving us here in this Bhagavad Gita. And Prabhupada guides us how to learn detachment. One must associate and hear. Associate with the spiritual master and hear from him. And thus one will learn how to detach from this material world. So this association with the Guru and hearing is very, very important. And so I said earlier in the discussion of the first verse that this basic principle of devotional service is detachment. Right? So detachment to the material world and attachment to Krishna. That is the principle of devotional service. And Prabhupada keeps guiding us that one should detach to the material world by attaching to bhakti. Right? One cannot detach from the material world until one attaches to this devotional service. Remember from back in the second chapter, Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur and Sri Baladev Vidyabhushan is giving commentary about that last section, about how controlling the senses cannot be done by any artificial means. It must be done by the higher taste of devotional service. So here Prabhupada is again guiding us that this detachment from the material world, it happens by the practice of devotional service. Then one naturally detaches from material activities through the attachment to the spiritual world. Otherwise, just giving up these sense desires is very difficult. We must replace them with something higher. Right? So the measure of our progress in devotional service, we sometimes wonder, am I making progress? Am I moving forward? The measure is, how much have I detached from my material allurements? Am I less materially attached today than I was 6 months ago? If I am, then I am making progress in bhakti, because this is the foundational principle of devotional service: detachment from the material world, right? Extricating oneself from these, extricating oneself from this banyan tree. Right? So, how Krishna comes into the picture of this banyan tree is, ultimately we must find the root of this tree, right? One comes to the base and they find Lord Brahma, right? That is like the foundational root of this base of this tree. And then one will ask, well then, who's the origin of Lord Brahma? And we know that origin of Lord Brahma is Krishna. So ultimately, we come to the point in understanding what Krishna told us in the 10th chapter, Aham Sarvasya Prabhavo, I am the source of everything. And so searching out this tree and finding its ultimate origin will bring one to Krishna. And from there, one will attach to Krishna and detach from that material world. Right? So to get out, one must surrender to Krishna. When one surrenders, one automatically becomes detached and is extricated from this very complex web of the material world, which is represented again by this banyan tree. So now Krishna is going to speak in the next verse about the qualification and the process to surrender to Krishna. Because surrendering to Krishna is the means by which one detaches from the material world. So Krishna says, those who are free from false prestige, illusion, and false association, who understand the eternal, who are done with material lust, who are freed from the dualities of happiness and distress, and who, unbewildered, know how to surrender unto that Supreme Person, attain to that eternal kingdom. So the first qualification is humility. One must be free from pride, being puffed up that, oh, I am the Lord of material nature. I am trying to be the boss, the master of the material world. I'm the self-made master of my domain. And that is the aspiration of so many. But one must lose that sense. Because with that consciousness, it's very difficult to surrender to Krishna. Oh, I'm self-made. I can do my own. Then what is the point to surrender? Right? So Krishna says, one must be free from the false prestige. This prestige that I am the doer, I am the owner, I am the proprietor. So with real knowledge, we'll understand that we are not the Lord of the material world, but we are actually the servant of Krishna. Then one can surrender. Prabhupada tells us, we're the proprietors of nothing. We need to be realistic and humble. We can't even eat a single grain of food without the mercy of Krishna. We'll see this in the later verses, in the section verses 12 through 15. How we cannot do any of this without Krishna. Right? So in the sixth purport, Prabhupada writes that every nook and corner of this material world is the property of the Supreme Lord. So we must become free from this idea that this material world even are my resources, and then one can actually surrender. So free from false prestige, this prideful illusion that one is under, is the key to being able to surrender. Otherwise, these faulty illusions will bind us in this material world, trying to enjoy the fruits, not realizing that Krishna is ultimately the source of all of it. Right? So now, then Krishna is going to explain what happens to that surrendered soul. Where do they go? What is the destination? And is it a permanent destination or not? So Krishna says in the 6th verse, that supreme abode of mine is not illumined by the sun or moon, nor by fire or electricity. Those who reach it never return to this material world. So Krishna said again in verses 3 and 4, one must surrender to get to free from the material world, to be detached. The qualifications was given in the last verse, and now Krishna is explaining what is the result. Right? So here Krishna again promises one does not have to return again, as he said in the 8th chapter, and will say again in the conclusions of the Bhagavad Gita. Right? So why does Krishna speak this verse about his supreme abode? He is speaking to increase our determination. If we hear about the greatness of the spiritual world, one will be inspired to reach it. Just like if we hear about some great place on this material world, oh, the beautiful beaches of Hawaii, then we have some desire to go there. So if we hear about the glories of the spiritual world, just like we heard in the 8th chapter about the glories of the spiritual world, it will increase our determination. It will sharpen our determination to reach there. Right? So Krishna is describing this in order to inspire us. And so Prabhupada in the purport gives a nice comparison of the consciousness of the material-oriented person versus the spiritually-oriented person. And the Prabhupada says in the purport, one should be captivated by this information that one is getting. So he says, in his conditioned life, the living entity considers himself to be the Lord of this material world. But in his liberated state, he enters into the spiritual kingdom and becomes an associate of the Supreme Lord, and there he enjoys eternal bliss, eternal life, and full knowledge. So Prabhupada says, right, in the conditioned life, the living entity thinks they're the Lord of the material world. But in the liberated state, he enters into the spiritual kingdom, becomes an associate of the Lord, and enjoys fully, eternally, permanently, life full of knowledge. So this is the result. It is a matter of consciousness. So, again, here in the purport, Srila Prabhupada is speaking about how to detach. And it happens by devotional service. Again, by the positive attachment to Krishna, one naturally detaches from the material world. But it is critical, and the core of this metaphor Krishna has presented in these first 6 verses, that one must detach from the complex web of this material world to find real happiness. And that complicated banyan tree is the metaphor that Krishna has been using. And so it is the only way, the only way, the only way. So Prabhupada concludes by saying that one should take very seriously to the practice of devotional service and escape the material world, the reflection, and attain the real tree, the real life of knowledge. Okay? So now, in the 7th verse, Krishna is speaking. The living entities in this conditioned world are my eternal fragmental parts. Due to conditioned life, they are struggling very hard with the 6 senses, which include the mind. So here Krishna is describing the position of the living entity entangled in the material world. And very importantly, we see they are struggling. That's the difficulty, right? So we need to know our relationship to Krishna in order to surrender to Krishna. Who are we and who is Krishna? Then one can understand this relationship of service. So Krishna has established very clearly that all the living entities in the material world, who are they? My eternal fragmental parts, Krishna says. So we are part and parcel of Krishna. We are created for one reason, to be enjoyed by Krishna. We are his separated expansions. And thus our constitutional position is to be eternally engaged in service to Krishna. That is an eternal fact, because we are his fragmental parts. The part always serves the whole. So, and this expansion, it is an eternally separated expansion, not temporary. The Mayavadis suggest that we have temporarily become separated, but in a liberated state we'll merge back within. No. This separated expansion is an eternal state. Both in the spiritual world, one remains individual, and in the material world, one remains individual. As Krishna said in the 2nd chapter, way back in the beginning. And Prabhupada gives some commentary about the distinction between the primary expansions, which are all the Vishnu Tattvas, Lord Ram, Nrsimhadev, Vamana, Matsya, Kurma, all the different avatars. Those are the primary expansions. We are the secondary expansions, the living entities. So both are expansions, but they are very different. One is Vishnu Tattva, one is Jiva Tattva. Okay, so let us not confuse those two. So now Krishna says that the conditioned life, they're struggling very hard with the 6 senses. The 6 senses are the 5 working senses that we know, plus the mind. Right? So the eyes, ears, mouth, tongue. Those 5 senses plus the mind. These are the 6. And the mind is very important because it is the coordinator of the activities of those senses. So it has a lot of power to direct our future, as we'll see in the coming verse. So Krishna used this word very importantly. He says, karshati, is struggling hard. So this is the nature of the living entity in this material world. It is a struggle. The false ego binds us, and the mind is driving us to so much activity, trying to find happiness, but it's not there. Like trying to find water in a desert. So difficult to get, right? And so we're chasing, get this, get that. And ultimately, even when we get what we are aspiring and working so hard for, it doesn't satisfy. Okay? So this becomes a very struggling existence. And Prabhupada says, why this is happening? It is by the misuse of our independence. It leads one to try to enjoy the fruits of the material world and thus struggle. One has the free will to try to do that. Right? So we have chosen, by our choice, to come to this very unnatural state, to be under the influence of the material energy. That is our choice, and it is our misuse of independence. However, by the proper use of our independence, by our free will, one can undo all of this, extricate themselves, and go back to the spiritual world, to our real state, our natural state, which is in loving service to Krishna. Because again, we are its eternal fragmental parts. Okay? So this is the natural state. The living entity. It is the child of Krishna who has come to this unnatural state of the material world, just as a fish out of water is on his unnatural state. But as we saw in the 13th chapter, the super soul Paramatma is so dear and a dear friend of the living entity, waiting for it to turn to him to instruct how to come back to its natural environment and find eternal bliss and happiness. And so we may wonder why the Paramatma is so dear to the living entity. Now we know. Why? Because we are fragmental parts. Just as, why is a child so dear to mother? Because mother gave birth to the child. There's a strong bond. So similarly, the living entity is so dear to Krishna. Why? Because we come from him. We are, he is our father. So that dear relationship exists because of this fact that the living entities in this world are the eternal fragmental parts. So that is the source of that strong attachment between the living entities and Krishna. And we can understand no one loves us more than the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So finally, we'll discuss the transmigration of the soul in the material world. So the living entity in this material world carries its different conceptions of life from one body to another, as the air carries aromas. Thus he takes one kind of body again and quits it to take another. So as we move from the different branches of the tree, we are shedding one body and acquiring another one. Right? So we have some control of this transmigration, some Ishvara of this. And how? It is by our minute independence. Right? We have desires that we can express, and those desires then take us to different activities. So our next birth, our next body, it is based on our activities and desires. Okay? So Prabhupada writes in the purport, he says, if he has made his consciousness like that of a cat or dog, he is sure to change to a cat or dog's body. And if he has fixed his consciousness on godly qualities, he will change into the form of a demigod. And if he is in Krishna consciousness, he will be transferred to Krishna Loka in the spiritual world, and he will associate with Krishna. So this is very clearly explained to us, right? That whatever we think, whatever is in our consciousness, we will achieve. We heard this in the 8th chapter, right? Yam yam vapis manam bhavam. That whatever we think of at the time of death, we achieve. Right? So here again, Krishna is explaining that based on the desires, we move from one body to a next. And Prabhupada is very vividly explained. If we have consciousness of a dog, we'll become a dog. Very, very simple. And this air carrying aroma analogy that Krishna has given, it's here to help us remind us again, as we saw in the 13th chapter, that the spirit soul is pure, remains pure throughout the transmigration through all the different branches of this banyan tree, through all the different bodies. The soul remains pure. And the example is given, the air. When the air, travels over a very, aromatic garden, it will pick up the scent of those roses. Or if it travels over a very foul place, it will pick up the foul scent. But the air itself is pure. It is simply carrying some scent. So the air remains pure. So similarly, the soul, though it is moving from body to body, it remains pure and untouched by the material nature, because it is part and parcel of Krishna. Krishna is untouched by the material world, and thus the living entity, the spirit soul, is also untouched. So Krishna uses this as an analogy to help us remember again, the soul is pure even though it is being carried by the mind to so many different bodies. it remains untouched. 9. The living entity, thus taking another gross body, obtains a certain type of ear, eye, tongue, nose, and sense of touch, which are grouped about the mind. He thus enjoys a particular set of sense objects. So what type of body is determined? Well, it is based again on the mind's desires. We get a particular type of senses, a particular type of form. That exact body is formed by the desires the mind has and the sanction of Krishna. And so the mind, again, is a very powerful force in the determinant of our future. It is not the independent determinant, but it has a very powerful role based on the various desires we have. And so we have seen this, again, from the 8th chapter. Krishna explained this and how to attain the supreme by shifting our desires to a very elevated state. But if we want to be naked, we'll get life as a tree. If we want to try to fly, we'll get life as a bird. If we want to run fast, life as a leopard. Prabhupada says, materially we're trying so hard to acquire all these things, the ability to fly or to move quickly. Simply nature will give us a body like that if we want it. And that we should be very careful of. Right? So ultimately, we should avoid becoming a servant to the mind and senses. So finally, Krishna says, the foolish cannot understand how a living entity can quit his body, nor can they understand what sort of body he enjoys under the spell of the modes of nature. But one whose eyes are trained in knowledge can see all of this. Okay? So the foolish do not see how they are moving from body to body, branch to branch, trapped by the desires of the mind and the activities of the senses. They don't know why they have this current body. They don't know what body in the future will be coming, why all this is happening. So blinded by the unlimited attempts to enjoy, they're simply absorbed in enjoying. And this intense desire to enjoy the material sense objects, it covers the ability to see the real nature of the soul, which is servant to Krishna. And thus they suffer mightily. Garshati. So this lust and desires are the key to the illusionment. So what is the cure? This jnana chakshusha, right? The eyes of knowledge. Krishna can help us see all of this very clearly. And he is revealing this knowledge for us so that we can understand the situation we are in. And if we understand it, then we can get out of it. See how we are bound. Who is at the root of all of this existence, the Supreme Lord, and how to get out about it. And Prabhupada says, one must approach Shastra and Guru. We approach Guru to understand this knowledge. And by doing so, one can get free from all of this. And so Prabhupada writes in the purport, makes a very important statement. He says, this requires a great amount of knowledge understood from Bhagavad Gita and similar literatures heard from a bona fide spiritual master. Prabhupada sums it up. It's a great amount of knowledge that one needs, and it is obtained through the scriptures and Guru. And thus, one can become free. So this is the first 10 verses of this chapter. We'll discuss the final verse of this section next week, and then move to verse 12 through 20 and conclude in understanding how one should surrender to Krishna and the summary of the Vedanta Sutras. Okay? Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Ananta Koti Vaishnavrinda ki jai. Any questions or comments today?
Hare Krishna Prabhuji, Dandavat Pranam.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji, Dandavat.
Very nice class, Prabhuji, very nice and nectarious class. And I always admire that what a nice images you keep for the explanation, bro. Very nice. The image I was just looking into the upside down banyan tree, it has all basically nicely represented that also. And I never imagined that we can show with the fish and the desired sense gratification activities around. Oh my goodness, very nice.
Right.
Thank you.
Right.
Guruji, I have kind of doubt, not really a question.
Yeah.
That in the spiritual world, even being taken a different forms, basically, like a fish, like a bird, or very close associates of Krishna also. There is no differentiation between all those, like we have here differentiation in material world.
So there are,
Everything is available in the spiritual world, whatever available here.
yeah, so there are different varieties of bodies in the spiritual world. So again, when one sheds the material body, one regains the eternal spiritual body. So in both the spiritual world and the material world, one has a form. But in the spiritual world, one has an eternal form. It is not a piece of machinery like this material body, which deteriorates. That's one distinction. But the varieties in the spiritual world are also there. So there are peacocks and birds and fish and in human form. Like that, there are different forms. But the relationship with Krishna is in its pure state. So in the fish body, one still is servant of Krishna in the particular rasa. Right? So there are different exchanges of relationship with Krishna that exist. One is that we see the cows and how they are exchanging this relationship with Krishna. But then we see how the cowherd boys may be exchanging their relationship with Krishna. Even what seemingly is inanimate in the material world, like the stones and the ground, that is also animate in the spiritual world. It's hard for us to conceptualize that, right? It's hard for us to understand. But even like the stones, they are life in the spiritual world. And they are rendering service to Krishna by giving him something pleasurable to see, creating some variety of landscape that is very soothing to the eyes. So in that way, it is a service. So everything in the spiritual world is animate and engaged in service to Krishna. Right? So that's the understanding. But there is not necessarily higher or lower life forms that we understand in the material world. But there is different degrees of intensity of service. On an absolute plane, they're all perfect in pure devotional service. But you might recall to a prior discussion where we said perfect, more perfect, and most perfect. Like that, there is a most intensity of love in that Madhurya rasa. And then, there are different gradations. Again, on an absolute level, they are all perfect. But there is some gradations there. So we don't consider it like we consider in the material world higher and lower life forms. But we can understand there is an intensity of love experienced differently based on with a variety of relationships. And again, one's position in the material world is based on one's desires. One's service in the spiritual world is also based on one's desires, inclinations. So that's how it exists.
So, the air carries the aroma, example. Soul is never, we said, as Krishna is not bound with this material world, the soul is also not bound with the material world. Can you please little focus on that? Because
Yeah.
we are comparing Krishna.
So because the soul is made out of spiritual energy, Sat Chitanananda, right? And in the second chapter, Krishna said that nothing material can touch the soul, right? You cannot cut the soul with a knife, because that is material. The knife is material. It cannot be wet by water, because that is material. It cannot be burned by fire. That is material. So nothing material can touch the soul, because it is of a higher platform, right? So the soul is always pure, because Krishna is never impure. Even when he comes to the material world, just like when the king enters the prison house to visit the prisoners, the king is not bound by the rules of that prison house. So when Krishna comes to the material world, he's not bound by the modes of material nature. He's completely aloof. He's untouched. And we use the example of the lotus flower in the water, right? The water is not touching the leaf. There's this wax-coaty surface. So because Krishna is pure, the soul is always pure, also pure. So then how it becomes entangled? Well, the soul becomes covered by the false ego. That is the first covering of the soul. And thus the pure consciousness of the soul becomes covered by the false ego, which leads one to then identify with the body. And then the various other coverings, the intelligence, the mind, and then the gross parts of the body, the earth, air, fire, water, and ether, manifest. So that is the nature. And the example we give is of a diamond. If I put a diamond in the mud, the diamond is not become impure. It has simply become covered. When you remove that mud, the diamond comes back just to what it always was. It wasn't, the mud didn't enter into the diamond. So similarly, the soul, no material contamination can enter into the soul or even touch it. It remains intact, fully pure. But the consciousness is covered by the presence of the false ego, just as the diamond is covered by the mud, and thus one cannot see the sparkle, one cannot see the pure consciousness until that false ego is removed. So that's how the nature of it, and the air carrying the aroma, the analogy kind of suggests that the air remains pure, the air particles. It is simply carrying a scent that is either pleasurable or unpleasurable.
That example is very nice. Thank you.
Hare
Thank you.
Hare Krishna, thank you. Yes, you have a question?
There's a question online from Radhika Vera. Hare Krishna Prabhuji. Krishna says to do all the prescribed duties. Then he also says, leave all the dharmas and surrender unto me. What are those dharmas he's talking about?
Yeah, so there are two levels of prescribed duties. There are the material prescribed duties, as enjoined in our basic structure of varnashram dharma. And those are the prescribed duties that are given by Krishna in the Vedas. But when one comes to devotional service, then one prescribed duties transcend to what we call Devi Varnashram, which are the spiritually prescribed duties. And those come from Krishna and through Guru, so that one understands what it is I'm supposed to do, what is my occupation, my dharma. And so one transcends the materially prescribed duties to the spiritual prescribed duties. And thus, Krishna says, one can renounce those material prescribed duties when one has come to the platform of devotional service. Otherwise, one must do those other prescribed duties to continue purifying, so that one ultimately can become free of all the material desires and come to pure devotional service. And this is explained in the purport in the second chapter about the Swadharma and how there are two Swadharmas. So you can reference that for a little bit more clarity on that. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay. So if not, then next week we'll conclude chapter 15 and see some very, very sweet verses about how Krishna is maintaining all the existence of our life and how to surrender unto him, and ultimately, the full summary of the Vedanta Sutras. Hare Krishna, Srila Prabhupada ki, Jayananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki, Hare Krishna.